Now, I wanted to pick up on something else you said earlier. You mentioned, the government or a government doing deals and things, and then without consulting, and then just announcing it to the public. And I want to ask you about two recent instances of this. The first being the proposal of the Bektashi sovereign state. Which took everybody by surprise. I wasn't quite sure. I was like, is it April Fool's Day? When I sort of read it, I was very surprised to see this. I mean, it's a very interesting idea, but it seemed to come out of nowhere. Now, obviously, under communism in Albania, religion was completely banned. Now, Albania very much prides itself on its religious tolerance, so to speak. I think it's not just tolerance, but from what I understand, Albanian people don't really care that much what religion everybody else is. Everyone just kind of gets on with it themselves. That's the feeling I get. But, I mean, we have a situation where you have a synagogue here. There's a couple of synagogues in Albania now, where you have a mosque and a Catholic church next to each other and everyone's happy. And, I've been to villages in Albania. One in particular, they have Orthodox first name and a Muslim surname. It's quite unique, this situation in Albania, I think. But this proposal for a Bektashi state, the Islam community here, the Islamic community were like, well, no one consulted us about this. Why are they getting special treatment? Blah, blah. Do you think this is going to disrupt the status quo? How do you think this idea came about? I'm interested in your thoughts on this.
So I had a little bit of the exact same reaction that you did. Actually, either a day or two after it was announced. I got a call from a BBC journalist, and he said, "Well, would you know anything about this? What's going on?" I said, "I have no idea. I don't know what to tell you. It's not normal, right, to wake up one morning, open up, the website for the New York Times, and read that there's going to be a microstate in your country. This is not how it's supposed to work anywhere. This is not how it's done." But unfortunately, I have to sort of say it again, Albanians are used to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I can mention any number of precedents where, the guy in charge comes out, bold declaration, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and then you just sort of put it out there, you test the system, you see what happens, you see how people react, you create alibis also. A lot of times these things don't pan out. They don't quite happen if you sort of follow them along. And so then it's a question of how serious was it? How intentional was it? Well, what is the backstory? Now, to your point, which I think is the more important point of the sort of the details, is that the religious coexistence, Albanian tolerance, obviously Albanians are proud of this, and they should be proud of this. We live increasingly in an intolerant world. Yes. Everywhere we look, including here in the United States, extremely polarized, political opponents are enemies, Islamophobia, you name it, all kinds of dynamics that are quite scary. And so that tradition of coexistence, and by the way, I also don't subscribe to this rosy picture that Albanian officials tend to kind of market, right? It hasn't always been rosy. And Albania was also the country where they outlawed religion and they closed the mosques and they destroyed the churches and they threw the Catholic priests in prison and they enshrined actually in their constitution. They said, we don't believe in God. And it was one of those rare countries in the world where that was enshrined in their official document. So we got to accept that part of the story too. Sometimes officials like to sort of mythologize this aspect. I think this aspect has been a dear aspect of their daily lives. It has required a lot of work, a lot of intellectuals and leaders in the community to kind of bring this about. And so the story is complex. It's worth getting that story and doing it seriously rather than through this kind of marketing that Albanian officials love to do. But the political process here is kind of dumbfounding. And one of the questions that the journalist asked me said, well, is this even constitutional? And of course, nobody seemed to have thought of the constitutional issues with the idea of kind of declaring a Vatican-style I mean, the Vatican, by the way, in Italian history, that arrangement took many, many decades. And it was kind of a political time bomb for ever since after the unification of Italy. So the idea that you're just going to get up one day and sort of throw this idea out there, unfortunately predictable for Albanian politics, but certainly not serious.
Mm. So you don't think it will pan out in reality?
I think there may be a watered down version of it, but not quite. I don't think quite the way that it was presented originally.
Because, you know, if they were going to say no to my Albanian passport, I was just thinking of maybe converting to Bektashiism. Maybe that was a second option for me. So it would be a bit disappointing if not.
And look, this is one of those other dimensions of the richness of Albanian religious life, the Bektashi community, and all the religious communities are to be appreciated, right? And this is kind of what makes Albanian society and also, to be honest with you, history interesting. Yeah. Because history would have been so much duller and so much more boring if we didn't have this. And so it's worth celebrating, but I think it's worth celebrating with action and concrete steps rather than slogans and PR, but they are PR machines, so they cannot help themselves.
It's actually this religious thing when I go abroad and I interact with people who don't know much about Albania, and they say, oh, is it a Muslim country? And I do like to go, well, I'm glad you asked that question. And I sit them down and I explain, and you know, by the end of it, they're just like, wow, this is fascinating. So it's something I quite enjoy talking to people about. It is a big selling point, if you like, for the country. Something else, talking again about decisions taken when we woke up one morning and were very surprised to find out about them, the Italy-Albania migrant deal. This was another one. I woke up at 5 a.m. I looked at the news. What on earth is... I have a house in Shenzhen and spend a lot of time there. I was thinking, blimey, what's happening, you know? So the migrant deal, as it stands at the moment, the migrants came here, they were sent back. Who knows what's going to happen with the migrant deal, whether they are going to be coming back to Albania. Giorgia Meloni is doing her best in the courts at the moment to try and fix the situation in her favour. But I've seen people commenting online. I saw Lea Upi, another former guest here. She made a comparison of these migrant centres to sort of, I think it was a concentration camp, and also Spach. And I mean, I'm still not quite sure how I feel about these migrant centres. I think there's been a lot of misinformation in the media about them and how they will work and everything. And I think much of my opinion would depend on how it plays out in practice. What I'm most annoyed about is the lack of public consultation beforehand. But these comparisons, I'm wondering, what do you think? Are they fair comparisons? Is it something we should be really concerned about? Is it dehumanizing? What's your view on this situation?
Well, I had a similar concern, and I'm gonna get to it in just a second on this issue of the transparency around these deals. I am in agreement with those who are sort of confused and also angry about the way this was all rolled out. I don't think, though, I'm not sure. I don't want to speculate on exactly what the comparison is trying to do, because I guess what that says is Edi Rama is a dictator and his government is a dictatorship. Kind of drawing a parallel between the deal and Spach.
It was more like the imprisonment of people with no just reason. You know, these migrants are going to be forcibly held, even though they haven't broken a law, they're pending a decision, you know, but because of the agreement, the centre will be closed and heavily guarded. So I think that was the comparison, you know. They haven't done anything wrong and they're being in prison.
Right. Yeah, it seems a little, I don't know that it works. I think we can do both things, right? I think we can critique the deal on its merits about what it says about Albanian politics today. But of course, we have to be informed about Albanian politics to kind of make that argument. And then I think we also need to sort of take history seriously and make analogies that actually work, that have depth to them historically. So we need serious histories of Spach. We need actual sort of ethics in dealing with our past rather than kind of, what I see in Albania now, it's this lack of interest even in distinguishing between fact and fiction when it comes to the past. Almost like there's no interest anymore in distinguishing between the two. So I'm not really sure that is the way to go about it. But what do I mean by critiquing this present deal on its own terms? Well, Alice, you probably have noticed, you definitely have noticed, because you've been dealing with Albanian institutions for a while now. But you go to their website, right? And almost every institution in Albania has a transparency tab. Programi transparences, programi transparences, programi transparences. Everyone talks about transparency. And the funny thing about the transparency is that the more you talk about it, the less you're actually practicing it. Because when a political system operates openly and publicly, it doesn't feel the need to kind of beat you over the head with a word, right? And so was there transparency here? And I think this is sort of the beginning. At first, we heard, we owe a historical debt to Italy. Then it turned out, well, actually, it wasn't about that. It was more of it was bundled into this issue of the beginning of the EU negotiation process. It's still confusing, right? We still don't really know how the deal came about. We know that the Italian prime minister came to Albania last year. There was some private meetings, there was some conversations off camera, but we still don't know how it actually came about. So that's for the first thing that I'd like to know. The second thing I'd like to know is, do most Albanians support this? I don't know that it matters. I don't know that the government cares, but I'd like to know how do most Albanians feel about this? And that's related to my third point, which is Albania has a very specific history when it comes to migration. And so they have lived on their own bodies the stigma and the discrimination and the special processing in detention centers and the media headlines, right? And this is a dynamic that they're very familiar with. And so that raises the question, what kind of country do we want? What is Albania going to look like in 20 years, 25 years? As the host of detention centers, by the way, of people who are looking for a better life themselves, and Black and brown people who are escaping poverty, are escaping conflicts, right? And so what does that mean? We have to really have a public discussion about, so let's not just talk about money and tourism and foreign investments and building skyscrapers in Tirana. Let's also talk about the soul of the country and what kind of country we want to have in 20, 30 years. Because in 1991, we said we want to be Europe, but the Europe of 1991 was a little bit different than the Europe of 2024. So maybe I think one thing we might need to think about is, in the process of joining this Europe, we also want to potentially change Europe from where it is in 2024. And that becomes a challenge, right? We're trying to join a moving target. We're trying to change something that has been deeply transformed. And so that's a challenge. I think that's the hard stuff, is to try and figure out what that looks like, what kind of a deal Albanian, because some people might say, well, okay, it's worth it as a political deal if we're going to go ahead on our path to the EU. And so you have to engage with that. As a politician, you have to engage with that as well, if that is what your voters say. But we don't really know, right? No. I mean, it's one of those big mysteries of these policies are thrown out there, but we need more robust assessment of how popular they are, how much backing they have, how viable they are. And so this was not, I don't think this was a win for Meloni, and it certainly was not a win for Rahman.
Do you know what I found really interesting about observing the debate? And that was Albania, you said it, Albanians have been migrants. They have emigrated. They've been migrants in countries all around the world. They've been in processing centres and they've paid thousands for documents and passports and permits and blah, blah, blah. But I think what's happening, and of course, since the end of communism, there have been foreigners coming to live in Albania. But I really think in the last maybe 10 years or so, we are seeing maybe more foreign people coming here to set up a permanent life, not just transitional sort of people with NGOs, diplomats, international organizations, but people like myself. I am an immigrant. I have chosen to live here. My daughter is half Albanian, half British. There are many others as well who have come, married Albanians, set up a life here, and they now have their second generation of children who are half Albanian, half foreign. And this is really interesting because this is the first sort of wave of migration, I think, into Albania. And I find that Albanians are really welcoming, and they're like, oh, your daughter speaks Albanian and English, that's amazing, and welcome, and you've integrated yourself so well. But then there is that fear, and I get comments all the time on social media. We don't want to be like the rest of Europe. You have a problem with migrants coming from third countries. But I'm like, well, actually, the UK is the third country, technically, if you want to talk about Europe. But they're fearful of this waves of migration of other nationalities coming, like they have in the UK, for example. I had an instance recently. I did a reel on social media with another British girl, and she is British Asian. And we put in the caption, 2 Brits talking Albanian in Albania, and the number of comments, she's not British, she's not British, she's not British, she's not British. And I was trying to explain she is, but in the UK we have this long history of immigration. She's more British than me, she's lived there longer than me, you know? And I was also, sorry, I'm going on, but in Shenzhen as well, they obviously kept a lot of Afghan refugees there after the US and the West left Afghanistan. There are several hundred still there. And what has happened now is they have acted as a pull factor, and there are Afghans coming to Albania, not under the previous agreement, but separately and seeking asylum here. So we have a wave of Afghan people coming to, not a wave, there's not like lots of them, you know, but they're coming. It's acted as a pull factor, and they're settling in Shenzhen. They're having families there. I've heard them speaking Albanian as well. And this is so interesting because it's the first time that this is happening in Albania, I think, in this way. But people are fearful of this as well because they've listened to a lot of the right-wing rhetoric in Europe, and they are fearful of that. So it's really interesting from 2 perspectives there, in my view.
Yeah, I agree. And I think we're seeing a little bit of it shouldn't be a contradiction. I don't want to present it as a contradiction, but it is. For historical reasons, because you know, Albania has had the history that it has had, and politically it has you know, particularly in the 70s and the 80s, sort of rejected the outside world. Pluralism was not really a way of life. Mm-hmm. And foreigners were often seen with suspicion for a long time, and it was quite dangerous actually. Yeah. To deal with foreigners. It sort of made them politically suspect, and it kind of made you also seem like, well, why are you know what? Mm-hmm. And so now, certainly though, that goes along with the other dynamic that we've been talking about, which is they're generous people. They're people who think very highly of families. They're family people. They understand, but they also understand suffering, and they understand sacrifice, and they understand that sometimes to get ahead and to get a better life, you need to leave the people that you love behind, mm-hmm. and you need to go out there and start your life from scratch. They invest highly in their children. They believe in education. They want a better future. And also, I want to highlight here, and here's kind of when I bring my historian background, that Albania does have a history of solidarity, mm-hmm. with people around the world, right? Jewish people during World War II, Palestinians during the Cold War, Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War. So it has had periods of its history where solidarity has been very central to its sense of self. There are things that one can build in Albania's past to create a political program, a political project that is viable, that is coherent, that speaks to the needs of ordinary Albanians, but doesn't fall necessarily for the far right, mm-hmm. talking points, which, you know, we live in the era of social media. I mean, we live in the area of the smart, moderate voice gets drowned by the lunatics who get all the attention and all the clicks and all the headlines. And so that remains a challenge. But I very much agree with you. It's the pluralism remains, and I think will remain a challenge, mm-hmm. how to actually live in a pluralistic way.